just before the end of April 2026, a team of researchers at Louisiana State University and the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University released a study that has been sitting in the monitoring community's reading stack ever since. The study was not about a single earthquake. It was not about a volcanic eruption or a tsunami warning or a data anomaly from a single monitoring station. It was about something that geophysicists who study subduction zones had theorized about for decades, but had never, until now, directly observed in a currently active system. It was about a fault system in the active, ongoing process of tearing itself apart. Not the fault releasing its stored energy in a great rupture, though that question is always open and always on the table for this particular fault. The fault itself, the geological structure that produces the ruptures, the architecture of the descending slab beneath the ocean floor, fragmenting piece by piece, while the monitoring community watches in real time from the surface above. The subduction zone in question is the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It runs along the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, from the northern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, south through Washington, Oregon, and into the northern edge of California, approximately 600 miles of fault boundary where the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced beneath the North American plate. The study was led by Brandon Shuck, then a postdoctoral research fellow at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, working with colleagues at Louisiana State University and other institutions. It used seismic reflection imaging, a technique that works like an ultrasound of the Earth's interior, sending acoustic signals into the ground and interpreting the reflected signals to reconstruct the geometry of the layers below, combined with earthquake records assembled from a dataset collected during the 2021 Cascadia Seismic Imaging Experiment, known as KC-21, which was funded by the National Science Foundation. What the imaging revealed was a structure that previous monitoring models had not fully described. A near-vertical tear in the ocean floor, approximately 22 miles long, cutting through the descending Juan de Fuca and Explorer plates from their upper surface to a depth of approximately 25 miles below the seafloor, located offshore northern Vancouver Island in the region called the Nootka Fault Zone. 3 days after that study was released, on the 2nd of May 2026, a second paper appeared in the scientific record. This study addressed a different but structurally connected question about the Cascadia system, its relationship to the San Andreas fault running through central California. Researchers using turbidite sediment records from both fault systems found evidence that the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the San Andreas can synchronize, that a full margin rupture of Cascadia can trigger large San Andreas ruptures within minutes through the propagation of seismic energy southward through the North American plate. If that mechanism has operated before in the geological record, and the turbidite evidence suggests it has, then the scenario for the next Cascadia rupture is not a single event. It is the beginning of a cascade. 12 to 15 million people live within the combined impact zone of both systems. The Pacific Northwest metropolitan areas, Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, Olympia, Eugene, and Victoria in British Columbia, sit in the direct path of the ground motion. California's Central Coast communities sit in the secondary footprint. The infrastructure connecting the western United States highways, bridges, the electrical transmission grid, ports that handle a significant fraction of U.S. Pacific Rim trade is concentrated in the region that both studies are now describing with new structural precision. This report covers both studies in full. It covers the monitoring infrastructure, the locked zone dynamics, the historical record of what this fault has done, and then it goes to the older layer, the layer that predates every monitoring instrument by centuries. There are people in tonight's report who were on the coast of the Pacific Northwest on the night this fault last fully ruptured. They were there. The ground shook beneath them. The ocean rose and covered their land. They survived. And what they witnessed in their oral traditions, in the accounts preserved across 326 years of transmission, describes this fault and what it does with a precision that researchers have now formally recognized in the scientific literature. Those accounts are the oldest surviving record of Cascadia's behavior, and tonight's ancient record section will examine them in full alongside written evidence from the other side of the Pacific Ocean that converges on the same specific night. There is a date in tonight's data that appears in two entirely separate archives, one written in Japanese, one preserved in an oral language that no European had encountered when the event occurred. Both archives describe the same night. We will reach both before this report closes. If tonight is your first time here, this is what we do at Last Light Bureau. We take the official data, the peer-reviewed research, the agency monitoring bulletins, the seismic imaging, and we lay it alongside the historical and ancient record, not to alarm, not to predict, to observe as precisely as the available evidence allows, where the modern monitoring data and the older record describe the same geological reality. We file every night. Subscribe before the briefing begins. We will not be back with this report. And wherever you are watching from tonight, especially if you are in Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, or California, drop your location in the comments. We track viewership across the Pacific Northwest coverage zone, and your location is part of what we are building. The briefing begins. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is not a well-known fault in the way the San Andreas is known, which is a remarkable fact given its capacity. The San Andreas runs through populated California, parallels the coastline, and appears on maps of every natural hazard discussion involving the American West. The San Andreas has generated famous, destructive earthquakes. 1,906, San Francisco, magnitude 7.9, 1,989, Loma Prieta, magnitude 6.9. The San Andreas is part of the cultural landscape of California in a way that reflects its visibility and its history. But the San Andreas is a strike-slip fault. The Pacific and North American plates slide horizontally past each other along its length. Strike-slip faults generate dangerous earthquakes, but they have a structural limitation on the maximum magnitude they can produce. The largest San Andreas earthquakes are expected in the magnitude 7.8 to 8. Zero range, serious, destructive, capable of causing tens of thousands of casualties in a densely populated region. They are not capable of the largest earthquakes the planet produces. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a different geological category. At Cascadia, a dense oceanic plate, the Juan de Fuca Plate, is being driven at a measured rate beneath the lighter North American continent. The Juan de Fuca Plate formed at the Juan de Fuca Ridge, an underwater mountain chain in the eastern Pacific where new oceanic crust is continuously created by the upwelling of magma from the mantle. The newly created oceanic crust cools, becomes denser, and begins its slow journey eastward. At the Cascadia Subduction Zone, it reaches the edge of the continental shelf and begins its descent. The descent is not frictionless. The Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced beneath a continent that is resisting its passage. The resistance is greatest in the section of the fault interface called the locked zone, the area where the plates are stuck together rather than sliding freely, where strain accumulates over decades and centuries and is eventually released in a great rupture. The locked zone at Cascadia extends from near the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California to a depth of approximately 12 to 15 miles beneath the surface and spans approximately 60 to 80 miles in width, measured horizontally from the coastline inland. Above this locked zone, the Earth's surface is being slowly deformed by the pressure of the two plates being forced together. The coastline is being dragged slightly toward the ocean. The ground is being tilted and compressed. GPS monitoring stations measure this deformation in millimeters per year. Every millimeter of deformation represents stored elastic energy that will be released when the fault unlocks. There is a number in tonight's data that has not been highlighted in any mainstream report covering the April and May 2026 research. It is the current GPS-measured rate of coastal strain accumulation near the zone of maximum expected coseismic slip. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the USGS maintain a network of continuous GPS receivers and other geodetic instruments across the Cascadia region. Those instruments show that the Juan de Fuca Plate is currently subducting beneath the North American plate at approximately 1 to 2 inches per year, depending on the specific location along the fault's length, and that the surface above the locked zone is being deformed at rates consistent with a fault that has not released its stored energy since the 26th of January 1700. 326 years of accumulated strain at the rates measured by the geodetic network. We will return to what that number means in the historical context before this report closes. The monitoring infrastructure for the Cascadia Subduction Zone is among the most comprehensive in the world for a fault system of its type, largely because of the sustained research investment that followed the scientific recognition in the 1980s that Cascadia was a fully active megathrust system capable of the largest earthquakes on the planet. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, known as the PNSN, is the primary real-time monitoring body for seismic activity in the Cascadia region. The PNSN is a collaborative operation between the University of Washington's Department of Earth and Space Sciences in Seattle and the University of Oregon in Eugene, in partnership with the United States Geological Survey and other institutions. It currently operates approximately 300 broadband seismic monitoring stations distributed across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and extending into southern British Columbia. Each station is a sensitive instrument capable of detecting ground motion across a wide range of frequencies, from the very low-frequency, long-period seismic waves produced by large, distant earthquakes to the higher-frequency waves produced by small, shallow local events. The network is dense enough to detect and characterize virtually every earthquake above approximately magnitude 1.5 inches, the Cascadia region, and smaller events in areas where station concentration is greatest. The data from every station flows continuously to processing centers in Seattle and Eugene, where automated algorithms detect and locate events in near real time. Duty scientists review the automated outputs and update the official earthquake catalog as each event is processed. The PNSN's earthquake catalog is public and updated continuously. A specific and important sub-capability of the PNSN monitoring system is its detection and cataloging of episodic tremor and slip events, known in the monitoring community as ETS events. ETS events are periodic slow-slip earthquakes that occur on the deep extension of the Cascadia Fault below the locked zone at depths of approximately 18 to 30 miles, where the fault interface is too warm and too plastic to generate conventional brittle earthquakes, but where the plates are still interacting. During an ETS event, the Juan de Fuca Plate slips a few centimeters beneath North America over a period of 1 to 3 weeks, accompanied by a swarm of tremors, seismic signals distinct from conventional earthquakes that propagate along the deep fault interface. ETS events occur in the Cascadia region approximately every 14 months in the northern section near Vancouver Island, with different recurrence rates in the central and southern sections. They were discovered in the early 2000s by Gary Rogers at the Geological Survey of Canada and Herb Draggart at the Pacific Geoscience Center, working with the dense GPS networks in the region. ETS events do not directly trigger megathrust ruptures. The evidence for a direct ETS to megathrust trigger is not established, but they do provide continuous information about the dynamics of the deep fault interface, and each one represents a small stress perturbation on the locked zone above. The PNSN publishes ETS event detections as they are identified. The second monitoring agency is the United States Geological Survey's Earthquake Hazards Program. The USGS maintains the authoritative catalog of historical seismicity for the Cascadia region, publishes the National Seismic Hazard Maps that inform building codes across the western United States, and conducts the research programs that translate monitoring data into publicly available hazard assessments. The USGS also operates the Shake Alert early warning system across Washington, Oregon, and California. Shake Alert uses the P wave, the compressional seismic wave that travels faster than the destructive S wave and surface waves, as an early warning signal. When a large earthquake is detected, the system issues automated alerts to phones, public address systems, and connected infrastructure in the affected region before the slower, more damaging waves arrive. For communities near the Cascadia Fault, the utility of Shake Alert is limited by physics. The P wave and the destructive S wave are generated by the same rupture, and for a fault that runs close to the coast, the time difference between the two may be measured in tens of seconds rather than minutes. Shake alert still provides actionable warning. People near the fault may have 10 to 20 seconds to drop, cover, and hold on before the worst shaking arrives. For communities farther inland, the warning window is longer. The third critical system is NOAA's Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, based in Palmer, Alaska. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center operates the DART buoy network, the Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunami System, which consists of deep ocean pressure sensors deployed across the Pacific Basin that detect the pressure signature of tsunami waves passing overhead. The DART buoys provide confirmation of tsunami generation and allow the warning center to assess the height and direction of the tsunami wave before it reaches coastal areas. For a Cascadia megathrust rupture, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center would issue warnings for Hawaii, Japan, and other Pacific coastlines within approximately 30 minutes of the earthquake. For the Washington, Oregon, and Northern California coastlines, the closest coastlines to the rupture zone, the tsunami arrives within 15 to 30 minutes of the earthquake itself, ahead of or simultaneous with any formal warning. The communities most exposed to the first tsunami waves are those on the low-lying coastal strips of the Olympic Peninsula, the Oregon coast, and the Humboldt County coast in California. Their only reliable form of protection is vertical evacuation, moving to high ground before the wave arrives, relying on community knowledge of tsunami evacuation routes and the natural warning of the ground shaking as their primary trigger. The April 29 Brandon Shuck study introduced a structural element that the prior monitoring models had not fully described. The Nootka Fault Zone is a transform fault, a strike-slip boundary that separates the Explorer Plate to the north from the Juan de Fuca Plate to the south within the Cascadia system. The Explorer Plate has been decelerating. Its current subduction rate of approximately 0.8 inches per year is approximately half the rate of the Juan de Fuca Plate to its south. This speed differential between the two plate segments, one descending at 0.8 inches per year, the other at 1.6 inches per year, creates stress that concentrates at the Nootka Fault Zone boundary. What Shuck's seismic imaging showed is that this stress has created a near vertical rip in the descending slab, approximately 22 miles long and extending approximately 25 miles in depth. The rip is cutting the descending plate at the boundary between the Explorer and Juan de Fuca sections. A small fragment of the Explorer Plate is peeling away while the Juan de Fuca section continues its descent. The process is geological in its timescale. The full separation of these two plate segments will take millions of years. But the structural consequence, visible now in the new imaging for the first time, is a fault architecture that is more complex than the prior regional models described. The existing boundaries between rupture segments, the places where past Cascadia earthquakes may have started or stopped, correspond, in the new analysis, to structural features in the fragmenting slab. The geometry of future ruptures may be shaped by the tiers that are currently forming. The May 2 synchronization study added a second dimension to the emerging picture. The researchers, working with turbidite records, the sediment layers deposited on the ocean floor when large earthquakes trigger underwater landslides that cascade down the continental slope, found that the timing of turbidite deposits from the Cascadia system and the San Andreas system overlaps in ways consistent with near simultaneous triggering. The mechanism is straightforward. A magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake generates ground motion that, as it propagates southward through the North American plate, passes through the regions where the San Andreas fault is locked and stressed. If segments of the San Andreas are near their rupture threshold, as some seismic assessments suggest, Southern California sections may be, the additional stress from Cascadia's seismic energy may be sufficient to trigger them. The result would be a multi-system rupture sequence, a Cascadia megathrust followed within minutes by one or more large San Andreas earthquakes. The combined ground motion, the combined tsunami threat, and the combined impact on infrastructure across the full Pacific coast of the United States would represent a scenario beyond the design basis of any single jurisdiction's emergency planning. This is the data on the board as of tonight. Now, we go to the record. The question of what happens to the Pacific Northwest coastline in the minutes and hours after a Cascadia megathrust rupture is documented in detail by the Oregon Resilience Plan, the Washington Seismic Safety Committee, and the FEMA Cascadia Subduction Zone Workgroup reports. The sequence, based on the modeling from the 2011 Tohoku event and the geological record of the 1700 Cascadia event, is the following. The rupture initiates somewhere along the locked zone, possibly offshore Oregon, possibly offshore northern Washington, possibly both simultaneously in a cascade. The seismic waves from the rupture travel outward from the source at several miles per second, reaching the Washington and Oregon coasts in approximately 30 to 90 seconds. The ground motion begins. It lasts between 3 and 5 minutes for a full margin rupture. During those 3 to 5 minutes, the structural integrity of every building, bridge, pipeline, and power transmission tower in the region above the locked zone is being tested against seismic design standards that may or may not be sufficient for the specific ground motion characteristics of a M9 class event. Simultaneously with the ground shaking, the seafloor along the fault rupture zone drops. The Juan de Fuca Plate, locked for 326 years against the underside of the North American plate, slips downward and eastward. The North American plate, released from its compressive deformation, rebounds. The coast, which has been tilted slightly inland by 326 years of strain accumulation, suddenly springs back toward the ocean. Parts of the coast that were above sea level may drop by 1 to 3 feet, submerging areas that had been dry land. The rebound and the seafloor displacement together generate the tsunami. The wave travels outward from the source at the speed of the ocean, depth approximately 500 miles per hour in the deep Pacific, slowing and growing in height as it enters shallow coastal waters. The first waves reach the Washington coast approximately 15 to 20 minutes after the rupture. They reach the Oregon coast approximately 20 to 30 minutes after the rupture. They reach California approximately 30 to 45 minutes after. They reach Hawaii approximately 4 to 5 hours after. They reach Japan approximately 10 hours after the same crossing time as the 1700 event, documented in the Iwate Prefecture records with a precision that Brian Atwater and Kenji Satake converted into a specific date and time. The Shake Alert system, if it operates as designed, will begin sending automated alerts to connected devices in the Pacific Northwest within seconds of the P-wave detection. Those alerts will provide approximately 10 to 60 seconds of warning for communities at varying distances from the fault, depending on their distance from the epicenter. For the communities closest to the coast, the ones in the direct path of the first tsunami waves, the alerts will arrive roughly simultaneous with, or slightly before, destructive ground motion. For communities farther inland, Seattle, Portland, the Willamette Valley, the alerts will arrive several seconds before the most intense shaking begins. Shake Alert is not a system that can make a megathrust rupture survivable by itself, but it is a system that can provide enough warning for people to stop what they are doing, move away from hazards, and take protective action, and for automated systems to respond, stopping trains, holding elevators, alerting emergency dispatch. It is the modern monitoring community's best available tool for reducing casualties in an event that cannot be prevented. The combination of the Brandon Shuck structural findings and the San Andreas synchronization paper adds a dimension to this scenario that was not previously in the official planning documents. If a full margin Cascadia rupture is followed within minutes by large San Andreas earthquakes in the mechanism described by the May 2, 2026 paper, then the emergency response resources of the Pacific coast of the United States would be simultaneously engaged across a footprint that spans from Canada to Mexico. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's capacity, the National Guard's capacity, the hospital network's capacity, the search and rescue resources of every affected state, all simultaneously committed to a multi-state catastrophe of a scale that no prior planning scenario has addressed in its full combined form. This is not speculation. It is the direct implication of the new research for the emergency management community. How that community responds to the new findings through revised scenario planning, through resource pre-positioning, through infrastructure investment will be visible in public agency communications over the coming year. The geological and documentary evidence for the last Cascadia megathrust rupture is one of the most thoroughly researched stories in the history of seismology, and it begins not with a seismometer but with a soil profile in the tidal flats of southwestern Washington. Brian Atwater joined the United States Geological Survey in the early 1980s and was assigned to study the earthquake hazard of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. At the time, the scientific consensus was still uncertain about whether Cascadia was truly a megathrust system capable of the largest earthquakes. Some geophysicists, noting the absence of large historical earthquakes in the written record of European settlers in the Pacific Northwest, which extended only to the late 18th century, argued that the fault might be aseismic, creeping slowly and releasing its stress continuously, rather than locking and releasing catastrophically. Thomas Heaton, then at the USGS, published a seminal 1984 paper arguing that the absence of historical seismicity was exactly what would be expected if the fault was locked and accumulating strain for a future great rupture, rather than creeping. He compared the Cascadia geometry to the Chilean subduction zone, which had been considered relatively quiet before the 1960 Valdivia M9.5 earthquake demonstrated otherwise. Atwater began looking in the coastal soil for the physical evidence. What Atwater found at Quileute Bay on the southwestern Washington coast was a layered soil profile that told a precise geological story. Below the surface mud of the present tidal flat, he found a layer of peat, the remains of a former salt marsh, a surface that had once been above or near high tide, supporting salt-tolerant marsh vegetation. Above the peat was a layer of sand, the deposits of a marine inundation, material carried inland by an ocean wave. Above the sand was more tidal mud, the normal ongoing deposition of the modern tidal flat. The sequence, marsh, sand, mud, was the signature of a sudden geological event. The marsh had been abruptly submerged, covered by a tsunami wave, and the coast had never returned to its former elevation. The earthquake had caused the coast to drop, and then the tsunami had covered the subsided land with sand. The coast had been at sea level ever since. Atwater found this same sequence at multiple locations along the Washington and Oregon coasts. At each location, the stratigraphy was consistent: a buried surface, a sand layer, then modern tidal deposits. Each location told the same story of a sudden subsidence event followed by marine inundation. The buried surfaces had plants rooted in them. At some sites, the roots and stumps of large trees, Sitka spruce, western red cedar, were preserved in the sediment. The trees had been standing on dry land. They had been killed by saltwater when the coast dropped beneath them. They did not die gradually. The outer rings of their wood, the most recent years of growth before death, showed no evidence of progressive stress. The trees were killed suddenly, in what arboreal terms is an instant. The ground dropped, the salt water rose, and the trees were dead within hours. The last full growing season preserved in the outermost rings of the dead trees was the season of 1699. The trees did not complete a growing season in 1700. The ghost forests visible today on the Pacific Northwest coast, the rows of dead trunks standing in tidal water at places like Copalis Beach in Washington and the Nicanicum Estuary in Oregon, are the physical remnants of those trees. They have been stripped of bark and branches by decades of tidal exposure. They are gray, weathered columns of wood, each one marking the position of a living tree on the 25th of January, 1700, and a dead tree on the 27th of January, 1700. They are the physical calendar of the fault's last great movement, readable by anyone who knows what they are looking at. The precise date was established by combining the dendrochronological evidence with the Japanese tsunami records. The last growing ring in the dead trees narrowed the event to the fall-winter period of 1699 to 1700. That window needed to be closed to a specific date. The closure came from Japan. Kenji Satake, a seismologist at the National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience in Tsukuba, Japan, was studying the Japanese records of tsunamis when he identified an anomalous event, a tsunami that had struck the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan in early 1700 with no associated felt earthquake. The records were in the administrative archives of coastal communities in Iwate Prefecture. The village of Chugaruishi, the port community of Kwagasaki in what is now Miyako, and the fishing community of Ochuchi each had surviving records describing the tsunami's arrival. One record specifically noted that the wave was unprecedented in the absence of shaking. The village headman of Miho in Kwagasaki wrote that the water behaved as a tsunami, but there had been no earthquake. This note was not mystified confusion. It was careful observation. The Japanese coastal communities of the Edo period had extensive experience with local tsunamis generated by the Sanriku coast's own subduction zone, and they knew that tsunamis were preceded by earthquakes. This one was not. That anomaly is what made the record findable and significant. Satake and Atwater worked together to match the Japanese records to the Cascadia evidence. The travel time of a tsunami from the Cascadia Subduction Zone to the Sanriku coast of Japan is approximately 10 hours at the speeds a tsunami achieves in deep water, traveling at several hundred miles per hour, losing height but not speed as it crosses the deep Pacific. The Japanese records indicate the wave arrived in the early morning of the 27th of January, 1700. Working backward, 10 hours before early morning on January 27 inches, Japan is approximately 9 inches the evening on January 26 inches, Pacific Standard Time. The dendrochronological evidence constrains the date to the winter of 1699 to 1700. The Japanese records supply January 26 to 27. The earthquake occurred at approximately 9 inches the evening Pacific Time on the 26th of January 1700. This date and time are now the foundational anchor of the Cascadia seismic record. Every monitoring agency, every hazard model, every emergency management plan in the Pacific Northwest references it. 326 years, 4 months, and 2 days have passed since that moment. The scale of what happened on the 26th of January 1700 is established by the physical evidence. The coast of Washington and Oregon dropped by between 1 and 3 meters, 3 to 10 feet along much of the fault's length. The coastal towns that native peoples had occupied were inundated by salt water. Forests were killed. Estuaries were reshaped. The tsunami that followed the subsidence reached heights of approximately 30 to 33 feet along the Washington coast. At Cape Flattery, the northernmost point of the Washington coast, the Maka people's oral tradition describes the ocean submerging the cape entirely. The tsunami reached Japan at 6 to 10 feet, still large enough to flood coastal communities and sweep away structures. It reached Hawaii, it reached the Philippines, it reached Indonesia. The magnitude of the 1,700 event is estimated between 8.7 and 9.2. The uncertainty in the estimate reflects the fact that no seismometric data exists. The magnitude must be inferred from the geological evidence of how much the coast dropped, how far it dropped, and over what length of the fault. Different methodologies produce results in the 8.7 to 9.2 range, all consistent with a full margin rupture of the Cascadia Fault from Vancouver Island to Northern California. This places the 1,700 Cascadia earthquake in direct company with the two largest instrumentally recorded earthquakes in history, the 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, which has been established at magnitude 9.5, and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, established at magnitude 9.0. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake is the largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded. It struck at 3:11 inches the afternoon local time on the 22nd of May 1960, rupturing approximately 560 miles of the Chilean subduction zone, directly comparable to the 600-mile length of the Cascadia Fault. The rupture caused the coastal land of southern Chile to drop by as much as 6 feet along hundreds of miles of coastline. Rivers changed their courses. Entire islands disappeared beneath the ocean. The town of Valdivia was flooded by the earthquake-generated landslides, and then by the tsunami that followed within minutes. The tsunami that crossed the Pacific reached Hilo, Hawaii, killing 61 people despite warning. It reached Honshu, Japan, killing 142 people despite more than 15 hours of crossing time. It reached the Philippines, killing 32. The total death toll was approximately 655 people, a figure kept low by the low population density of coastal southern Chile in 1960 and the fact that the earthquake struck in daylight when most people were awake and mobile. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake struck at 2:46 in the afternoon local time on March 11, 2011 with a magnitude of 9.0, rupturing approximately 300 miles of the Japan Trench Subduction Zone off the northeastern coast of Honshu. The rupture was only half the length of the full Cascadia Fault Zone but generated one of the most destructive tsunamis in modern history. The tsunami waves reached heights of up to 133 feet in specific locations, inundated areas extending several kilometers inland across large stretches of the Tohoku coastline, and killed approximately 19,750 people. The earthquake caused the main island of Japan to shift approximately 8 feet eastward and caused parts of the northeastern coast to drop by as much as 2.5 feet. It triggered the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. It damaged or destroyed approximately 140,000 buildings. The Tohoku event is the reference scenario for Cascadia emergency planning because its physical parameters subduction zone megathrust, magnitude 9 class, 300-mile fault length are a floor for what Cascadia would produce. Cascadia's fault zone is twice as long. The locking parameters are at least as intense. The geological record suggests the 1,700 rupture was of comparable or greater magnitude to Tohoku. The coastal populations most directly exposed to the first waves. The communities on the Washington and Oregon coasts within 15 to 30 minutes of tsunami arrival are mostly small towns and tribal communities with varying degrees of vertical evacuation infrastructure. The major metropolitan areas sit farther from the immediate tsunami zone but squarely within the zone of catastrophic ground motion. The pattern in the modern record is clear. The fault is locked. The plates are fragmenting internally in ways newly documented. The synchronization risk with the San Andreas has been formally described. The last rupture was 326 years ago. We do not stop at the modern record. There is an older layer, a layer that named this fault, described its behavior, and preserved the account of the last time it moved in the most authoritative documentary forms available to the people who experienced it. That layer is what comes next. And it begins with the people who were standing on the coast of the Pacific Northwest when the ground began to shake at 9 inches the evening on the 26th of January, 1700. The oral traditions of the coastal peoples of the Pacific Northwest are the oldest continuous documentary record of Cascadia megathrust earthquake behavior that exists. They predate every written account, every seismograph, every GPS receiver, every sediment core. They were composed and maintained by people whose communities were on the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California for thousands of years before European contact, and who experienced Cascadia megathrust earthquakes not as geological abstractions but as events that killed community members, destroyed villages, reshaped the coastline, and altered the geography of their ancestral territories. The knowledge of what had happened and what the warning signs meant was encoded into oral tradition, into the most durable form of knowledge transmission available to cultures without writing and passed across generations. Ruth Ludwin, a seismologist at the University of Washington, spent years systematically analyzing oral traditions from the Pacific Northwest coast, specifically for earthquake and tsunami content. Her work, published in peer-reviewed scientific literature and subsequently cited widely, established that the coastal peoples of the Pacific Northwest had a detailed understanding of Cascadia megathrust behavior encoded in their traditions, and that specific accounts could be matched with careful analysis to specific Cascadia rupture events in the geological record. Working with colleagues including Carl Thrush, Kathleen James, and others, Ludwin identified that the traditions did not simply describe an abstract category of natural disaster. They describe specific physical phenomena, ground motion of extreme intensity, coastal subsidence, massive marine inundation at specific geographic locations, in ways that match the sediment core and subsidence evidence for Cascadia ruptures at those locations. Alan Macmillan and Ian Hutchinson of Simon Fraser University extended this work by systematically mapping the geographic distribution of earthquake and tsunami oral traditions along the Pacific Northwest coast against the geological evidence for Cascadia ruptures. Their analysis confirmed what Ludwin's work had suggested, that the coastal peoples had been encoding Cascadia events in oral tradition for multiple earthquake cycles, not just the most recent 1,700 event. The range of traditions they identified from the Yurok in Northern California to the Kwakwaka'wak at the northern end of Vancouver Island in British Columbia covered the full geographic extent of the Cascadia Fault Zone. The traditions had been maintained by communities living directly above the fault over the exact stretch of coastline that the USGS seismic imaging now shows as the locked zone. The primary symbolic framework in which the Quileute and Hoh peoples of the Washington coast encoded the Cascadia earthquake is the conflict between Thunderbird and Whale. In Quileute and Hoh cosmology, Thunderbird is the most powerful sky, being the entity that controls the wind, the storm, and the great forceful movements of the natural world. Whale is the power of the ocean, not a specific animal, but the force of the deep sea itself, the weight and momentum of the water. When Thunderbird and Whale battle, they battle at the boundary between sky and sea and land, and their battle shakes everything. The specific account recorded by Albert Regan in the 1930s from Quileute and Hoh, oral sources published in the Journal of American Folklore and the Myths of the Hoh and Quileute Indians, describes Thunderbird seizing Whale and carrying it over the mountains, struggling so violently that the mountain was shaken and it was impossible to stand upon it. The shaking is so severe that no one can stand. Then Whale is dropped, and the great waters rise, and the ocean comes across the land. The phenomenological accuracy of this account, as interpreted by Ludwin and other researchers, is specific. The shaking so severe that no one can stand. This is the description of modified Mercalli intensity, 9 to X ground motion, violent to extreme shaking, which is what the near-fault ground motion of a magnitude 9 earthquake produces at the surface above the rupture zone. The ground motion at the Quileute ancestral village sites on the Washington coast during the 1700 rupture would have been of this intensity. The rising of the ocean. This is the tsunami. The account does not describe the ocean rising gradually. It describes a sudden, overwhelming marine inundation following the shaking, which is the sequence. The earthquake produces the ground motion. The ground motion causes the seafloor to rupture and displace the water column. The tsunami travels at hundreds of miles per hour and reaches the coast within minutes of the rupture. The Quileute and Hoh tradition preserved the sequence shaking, then ocean, because the people who witnessed it experienced it in that order. The detail of the Thunderbird carrying Whale over the mountains and the mountain shaking is geographically specific to the Olympic Peninsula region of Washington, where the Olympic Mountains rise immediately behind the narrow coastal strip occupied by the Quileute and Hoh peoples. The image of the battle occurring above the mountains, above the high country inland from the coast, is consistent with the experience of an earthquake generated directly below. The coastal plain and the mountains above it, the Maka people, who have occupied Cape Flattery at the northwestern tip of the Washington coast since before recorded history, preserved an account that researchers have identified as the most geographically specific indigenous description of the 1,700 tsunami available. The account describes the following sequence. The ocean receded quickly, exposing the seafloor. Then it rose again, rising until it submerged Cape Flattery, the cape itself, the promontory that the Makah had occupied for generations. Canoes were stranded in the trees. The water covered everything. This account contains a key observable detail that distinguishes it from a generalized description of flooding: the drawback. Before the main crest of a tsunami arrives at a coastline, the trough of the wave arrives first, pulling the water back from the shore and briefly exposing the seafloor. This drawback phenomenon is a specific, observable feature of tsunami behavior that is not shared by storm surges or ordinary floods. The Maka account of the ocean receding before rising is a precise observational record of the 1,700 tsunamis drawback at Cape Flattery, preserved in oral tradition for 326 years. The Yurok people of Northern California, occupying the coast near the southern terminus of the Cascadia Fault Zone, encoded their account of the 1,700 earthquake in a different symbolic framework, but with the same specific physical content. The Yurok tradition, as preserved and translated from ethnographic sources, describes an entity called earthquake running up and down the coast. His feet are heavy and powerful, and when he runs, the ground shakes so severely that it drops and the ocean pours in. The earth would quake and quake again, said the Yurok account, and the water was flowing all over. The people went to the top of a hill to escape. When they looked down, the water had covered their village and the whole coast. The Yurok account is seismically precise in two details. The repeated quaking megathrust ruptures produce extended sequences of shaking, not a single jolt, and the 1,700 rupture would have produced several minutes of intense ground motion and the coastal inundation, with the survivors going to high ground to escape. The survival behavior described in the tradition, moving to high ground immediately after the shaking, is exactly what modern Pacific Northwest tsunami evacuation planning teaches. The Yurok oral tradition was teaching the same lesson from direct experience 326 years ago. The Tillamook people of the Oregon coast, the Cowichan of Vancouver Island, the Squamish of southern British Columbia, and many other coastal peoples along the 600-mile extent of the fault preserved their own accounts of the earthquake and tsunami in various forms. Some of these accounts are less precisely datable to the 1,700 event. Some may reference earlier Cascadia ruptures. The geological record shows 19 major ruptures in 10,000 years, and a community that experienced multiple cycles would have multiple layers of memory encoded in its traditions. The scholars who have analyzed these traditions most carefully are explicit about the limits of their interpretations. Oral traditions are complex, multi-layered documents that accumulate meaning across multiple generations of transmission and do not always preserve a single event with perfect clarity. But the pattern across the entire coastal Pacific Northwest of traditions describing extreme earthquake shaking, coastal subsidence, and massive tsunami inundation at locations that correspond precisely to the Cascadia Fault Zone is, in Ruth Ludwin's assessment, too consistent and too geographically specific to be coincidental. These traditions were documenting the fault's behavior. They were doing what the PNSN now does with seismometers, building a record of what this fault is capable of so that the people living above it would know. That record was maintained in oral tradition across 326 years. Tonight, it sits alongside the seismic imaging from KC2-1, the locked zone GPS measurements, and the turbidite evidence for Cascadia San Andreas synchronization on the same analytical table. The second tradition in tonight's ancient record is not mythological, it is administrative and documentary. It is the Japanese village records of the Orphan tsunami of January 1700, and it is the archive that supplies the exact date and approximate time of the last Cascadia rupture. The Edo period in Japan, which ran from 1603 to 1868, was a time of extensive local governance and community record-keeping. The Tokugawa shogunate maintained a system of local administration through domain lords, and local officials at the village and community level were responsible for maintaining records of significant events as part of their administrative duties. These records covered harvests, fires, weather events, court proceedings, commercial transactions, and natural disasters. The records were not centralized or systematically preserved for posterity. They were local administrative documents. The survival of any particular record depended on the accidents of history, whether the original document was destroyed by the fires, floods, or military conflicts that periodically devastated Japanese communities over subsequent centuries, or whether it survived in archives that were eventually cataloged and made accessible to researchers. The survival of the 1,700 tsunami records in Iwate Prefecture is not complete, but enough records survive from enough communities to establish the event precisely. The communities with surviving documentation include the fishing village of Tsugaruishi on the Sanriku coast, the commercial port of Kuwagasaki in what is now the city of Miyako, and the fishing community of Otsuchi, also in Iwate Prefecture. The Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan is one of the most tsunami-prone coastlines in the world. The communities of this coast had extensive historical experience with tsunami events. They knew what a tsunami was, they recognized it when it arrived, and their record keepers documented it as a matter of course. The records of the 1,700 event that survived describe a wave that arrived on the morning of the 27th of January, 1700. The waves were estimated at 6 to 10 feet in height at the Japanese coast, large enough to flood low-lying areas, wash away wooden structures, and deposit sand above the normal tide line. The anomalous feature of this event, the feature that made it scientifically significant when Kenji Satake investigated it in the early 1990s, was the absence of a felt earthquake. The scribe at Kuwagasaki, identified in the records as the village headman of Miho, wrote explicitly that the water behaved like a tsunami, but that there had been no shaking of the ground. This observation is the key to the record. Every tsunami the Sanriku coast had previously experienced had been preceded by an earthquake felt locally. A tsunami without a preceding felt earthquake was anomalous. The village headman noted the anomaly because it was significant. He did not know the explanation. He had no information about a subduction zone 5,000 miles away. He simply recorded that the wave was unexplained. The explanation was not supplied until Satake's analysis in the 1990s. Seismic waves from a distant earthquake travel through the solid earth at speeds of approximately 3 to 5 miles per second. Over a distance of 5,000 miles, even the long-period surface waves from a magnitude 9 earthquake attenuate to below the threshold of human perception. The ground in Japan would not have shaken in any perceptible way. The ocean wave, however, retains sufficient energy to arrive at a distant coastline at a height of 6 to 10 feet after crossing the Pacific. The wave was the only evidence in Japan that the Cascadia megathrust had ruptured. The scribes of Iwate Prefecture recorded that evidence. 3 centuries later, it was the key that allowed the 1,700 earthquake to be dated precisely. Satake coordinated with Brian Atwater and others to complete the triangulation. The Japanese records supplied the date of the tsunami arrival, the morning of the 27th of January, 1700, in Japanese local time. The travel time from Cascadia to Japan, approximately 10 hours subtracted from the Japanese arrival time, yields the earthquake origin time, approximately 9 inches the evening. Pacific Standard Time, on the 26th of January 1700. The dendrochronological evidence from the ghost forests confirmed the winter 1699 to 1700 date. The 2 archives, the Japanese administrative records and the Washington ghost forests, converged on the same moment from different directions. The Japanese records are not mythological accounts. They are not prophetic texts. They are the careful documentation of a coastal community noting that something unusual had happened. The village headman of Miho was not recording the fulfillment of a prophecy. He was recording an anomalous wave for the administrative record. That act of meticulous documentation, performed in the context of an entirely mundane administrative responsibility in a coastal village on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, is now one of the 2 foundational documents in the reconstruction of the last Cascadia megathrust rupture. The other is the oral tradition of the Quileute and the Ho and the Maka and the Yurok, preserved across 326 years without writing. 2 archives, 2 continents, 2 cultures with no knowledge of each other. The same night. The depth of the Quileute oral tradition's earthquake knowledge goes beyond the single account of the Thunderbird and whale battle. Researchers who have surveyed the full body of Quileute oral literature have identified multiple separate accounts that reference earthquake and tsunami events, accounts that, when mapped against the geological record of Cascadia ruptures, suggest the oral tradition was preserving memories of multiple earthquake cycles, not just the most recent 1700 event. The geological record shows 19 confirmed major ruptures in the last 10,000 years. If the Quileute oral tradition extends its memory back through multiple rupture cycles, then the oldest layers of the tradition may preserve observations of earthquakes that occurred hundreds of years before 1700 observations made by people living on the same coastline, above the same fault, generation after generation. Albert Regan, who worked with Quileute and Ho communities in the early 20th century and published ethnographic accounts of their oral literature in academic journals, documented accounts in which the Thunderbird and whale conflict was described as having occurred multiple times, not as a single historical event, but as a pattern, a recurring reality of the coastal world. This is consistent with the paleoseismic evidence. Cascadia has ruptured repeatedly. The people living on its coast across thousands of years of occupation would have experienced multiple ruptures, and their oral traditions would have accumulated accounts of each one, layered upon each other in the complex multi-generational narrative that oral traditions become across centuries of transmission. Ruth Ludwin's analysis explicitly addressed this multi-event complexity in her published work. What she was able to establish with confidence was that the geographic distribution of the traditions, their concentration along the Cascadia coastline, their specific descriptions of coastal subsidence and tsunamis in locations that correspond precisely to the fault zone, was too consistent to be coincidental, and that the scientific content of the traditions was accurate enough to be recognized as the product of direct observation. These were not imagined events. They were experienced events, encoded in the most durable form of knowledge transmission available to their composers. The research work that Ludwin, Macmillan, Hutchinson, and others have done to document, translate, analyze, and publish the Pacific Northwest indigenous oral traditions as scientific evidence of Cascadia rupture history has a specific institutional significance. It represents the formal recognition by the scientific community that oral traditions constitute valid, documentable, geographically specific evidence of geological events, evidence that, in the case of Cascadia, predates the oldest European written record of the region by centuries. This recognition has implications beyond Cascadia. It represents a methodological expansion of how paleoseismology can document the behavior of faults over historical timescales, using the accumulated observational knowledge of the communities that have lived above those faults for the longest periods of time. The specific geographical precision of the Maka account deserves additional attention. Cape Flattery is the northernmost point of the contiguous United States, a headland that extends into the Strait of Juan de Fuca at the entrance to Puget Sound. It is the area where the 1,700 tsunami modeling predicts the highest run-up heights on the Washington coast. The modeling by Satake and colleagues suggests that the tsunami run-up at Cape Flattery may have reached 30 to 35 feet in certain locations. The Maka account of the Cape being submerged by the rising ocean is geographically and physically consistent with this modeling. A tsunami wave of 30 to 35 feet striking Cape Flattery would produce exactly the submersion described in the tradition. The Japanese Orphan tsunami records deserve further examination in their historical and institutional context. The Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan had experienced tsunamis generated by the Japan Trench Subduction Zone in 1611, 1677, and other years. Each of these events was documented in local records. The scribes and officials who maintained these records had a framework for understanding tsunami events. They occurred after local earthquakes, and they were to be documented as a matter of administrative responsibility. The 1,700 event fell outside this framework in the specific way that made it scientifically significant 3 centuries later. The earthquake was missing. The surviving records from Tsugaruishi document the wave height at approximately 7 feet above normal tide level. At Kuwagasaki, approximately 9 feet. At Otsuchi, the record indicates flooding of coastal structures. The distribution of wave heights along the Japanese coast is consistent with the tsunami having originated from a distant trans-Pacific source, The heights were relatively uniform along the Sanriku coast, as would be expected from a distant source, rather than varying dramatically by location, as would be expected from a nearby Japan Trench earthquake. This analysis confirmed the Trans-Pacific origin and helped constrain the size of the 1700 Cascadia earthquake. The Edo period administrative records that survive to be examined by Satake are the product of a specific cultural practice, the Japanese tradition of meticulous local documentation. The scribes who produced these records were not scientists. They were local officials doing their jobs, noting significant events for the record. That practice, the same instinct toward documentation that produced the monitoring bulletins of the USGS and the PNSN, is what preserved the 1700 earthquake's date for the scientific community 3 centuries later. The village headman of Miho, who noted the anomalous wave, was exercising the same observational discipline as Brian Atwater when he walked the tidal flats of Willapa Bay and noted the anomalous soil stratigraphy. Careful observation, careful documentation, the willingness to note the anomaly rather than dismiss it. This is what the historical record is built from, across all cultures and all time periods. The third tradition in tonight's ancient record comes from a different time, a different geography, and a different cultural context. But the phenomena it describes are recognizable to anyone who has read a USGS bulletin on subduction zone mechanics. Isaiah, chapter 24, opens the sequence of prophetic texts in the book of Isaiah that scholars call the Isaiah Apocalypse. Chapters 24 through 27, which address the fate of the earth and all of its inhabitants in terms that are more cosmic in scope than the specific political prophecies that dominate much of the rest of the book. Chapter 24 is dated by most textual scholars to the late pre-exilic period, approximately the 7th century BCE. The text was composed in Hebrew and has been transmitted through the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint across more than 2,500 years. The passage most directly relevant to tonight's event is found in verses 19 and 20. Verse 19, "The earth is broken up, the earth is split asunder, the earth is violently shaken." Verse 20, "The earth reels like a drunkard, it sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls never to rise again." The original Hebrew text uses 4 distinct verbs for the earth's movement in verse 19, intensifying repetitions that mark the event being described as extreme, as beyond ordinary experience, as at the outer boundary of what the earth can do. The imagery in verse 20, the earth reeling like a drunkard, swaying like a temporary shelter in a storm, is the specific description of ground motion that exceeds the capacity of structures and standing human beings to remain stable. This is not the ordinary shaking of a magnitude 5 or 6 earthquake. It is the violent, sustained, disorienting shaking of an event at the threshold of what the planet's tectonic system produces. Each clause in these 2 verses corresponds to a physical phenomenon documented in the geological record of the 1700 Cascadia rupture. The earth being broken up, surface rupture, the physical opening of the ground along fault traces, the earth being split asunder, the lateral displacement of the land surface, the kind of horizontal movement that the GPS record shows accumulating in the Cascadia locked zone over 326 years of strain buildup, the earth being violently shaken, the ground motion itself, several minutes of intense shaking at modified Mercalli 9 to X intensity across the coastal and inland Pacific Northwest. The earth reeling and swaying, the ground motion so intense that standing structures cannot maintain their geometry, that standing human beings cannot maintain their balance. This is the ground motion that the USGS shake map modeling for a Cascadia megathrust projects across the Pacific Northwest in a future full margin rupture. The phenomenological vocabulary of Isaiah 24, the earth broken, split, shaken, reeling, falling, is the vocabulary of a tectonic event at the magnitude 9 level. The passage is the most precise description of extreme seismic ground motion in the Hebrew prophetic corpus. It does not name the fault, it does not place the event in a specific geographic location, but it describes, in the only technical vocabulary available to a 7th century BCE prophet, what the earth does when the stored elastic energy of a subduction zone is suddenly released. The description is accurate. It is on the record. It was written 2,600 years before the USGS had instruments to confirm it. The fourth tradition in tonight's report comes from one of the oldest, continuously transmitted bodies of sacred literature in the world. The Atharva Veda is the fourth of the Vedas, the foundational sacred texts of the tradition from which Hinduism developed. Of the four Vedas, the Atharva Veda is distinguished by its concern with the material world, with the practical, physical dimensions of human existence, and with the natural forces that shape human experience. Its oldest portions are believed to date to approximately 1000 BCE, though the tradition acknowledges that the texts encode knowledge from still earlier periods of oral composition. The Atharva Veda was composed in Sanskrit and transmitted orally across multiple generations before its texts were stabilized in written form. It survives in two major recensions, the Chanakya and the Paipalada, both of which preserve the Prithvi Sukta, the hymn to the earth. The Prithvi Sukta occupies Book 12, hymn 1 of the Atharva Veda in the Chanakya recension. It consists of 63 verses addressed to Prithvi, the earth as a goddess, a mother, and a physical reality that the Vedic tradition understood to be both nurturing and potentially violent. The hymn is one of the most extensive addresses to the earth as a physical entity in any ancient literature. It describes the earth's qualities, its vastness, its patience, its capacity to bear the weight of mountains and forests and rivers and seas and the communities of human beings that depend on it. And it acknowledges with the directness that characterizes the Atharva Veda's engagement with the physical world that the earth shakes, that it trembles, that it is not always still. Verse 12 of the Prithvi Sukta in translation, "Whatever I dig out of you, O earth, may you have a quick recovery again. May we not hit your vital spot, O purifier." The acknowledgement that the earth has a vital spot, that it can be injured, that its structure can be disrupted in ways that are consequential, is the acknowledgement of a living, responsive physical system with internal organization that can be damaged. The Vedic understanding of the earth was not the modern tectonic model. The Prithvi Sukta does not describe plate boundaries or subduction zones, but the knowledge that the earth trembles, that the foundation beneath human communities is not absolutely stable, is encoded in this hymn as a fact so well established that it is mentioned in passing. Verse 35, "May we not injure your vitals or your heart." This plea is a plea for protection from the consequences of the earth being disturbed, consequences that include the earth's shaking, the earth's instability, the earth's capacity to respond to disruption with its own violence. The earth has a heart, the earth has vitals. The earth can be injured, and when it is injured, it responds in kind. This is the language of a tradition that had experienced earthquakes. The Indian subcontinent is seismically active, with multiple major subduction zones, fault systems, and collision zones, and had incorporated that experience into the most authoritative document it possessed for addressing the physical world. Verse 63 closes the hymn, "May you be happy, O earth, and may we be happy on you." This closing request for mutual happiness between the human community and the earth it depends on is the request of people who understand that the earth's happiness and the earth's stability are not guaranteed, that it can shake and disrupt and overwhelm. The Prithvi Sukta was composed as a protective hymn because protection was needed. The earth trembles. The tradition knew it. The hymn addressed it. 4 traditions, 4 languages, 4 civilizations that did not know each other existed. The Quileute oral tradition from the coast of Washington, describing the shaking and the rising of the ocean in the only vocabulary available to a people without writing. The Japanese Edo period scribes of Iwate Prefecture, recording an anomalous wave with no felt earthquake and noting the anomaly carefully for the administrative record. Isaiah 24 from the Hebrew prophetic corpus, describing the earth broken and split and shaken and reeling with an intensity that exceeds any ordinary description of earthquake phenomena in that literature. The Prithvi Sukta from the Atharva Veda, addressing the earth as a physical reality that trembles and has vitals that can be disrupted, Each tradition was composed by people who had either directly experienced the phenomena they described, or who encoded in their most authoritative cultural documents the accumulated knowledge of what the earth is capable of. The Atharva Veda's Prithvi Sukta is particularly significant for what it represents institutionally within the Vedic tradition. The Vedas are the most authoritative, most carefully transmitted, most institutionally protected documents in the tradition. The transmission of the Vedic texts was managed across generations by trained specialists whose specific function within their communities was to memorize, recite, and preserve the texts without alteration. The preservation methods were extraordinarily rigorous. Multiple forms of recitation, cross-checking memorization, and institutional oversight of transmission. A text that was included in the Vedas was a text the tradition considered important enough to be preserved with the highest level of institutional care. The Prithvi Sukta was considered important enough for this preservation. Its acknowledgement that the earth shakes, that the earth has vitals that can be disturbed, that protection from the earth's violence is something human communities need. This was considered knowledge important enough to be encoded in the Vedas and transmitted across 3,000 years. The reason the Prithvi Sukta is in the Vedas is that the composers of the Vedic tradition had experienced earthquakes. The Indian subcontinent sits at the convergence of the Indian and Eurasian plates, one of the most tectonically active collision zones on the planet. The Himalayan mountain range is the physical product of 50 million years of that collision. Earthquakes in the Himalayan zone and along the subduction boundary of the Indian plate have been occurring throughout the entire period of human habitation of the subcontinent. The Vedic tradition was composed by people who lived on tectonically active ground. The Prithvi Sukta was preserved because the knowledge it encoded was real, was important, and needed to be transmitted to every future generation who would live on the earth that the hymn described. The connection between the four traditions and the April and May 2026 Cascadia research is not a claim that any of these traditions predicted the new findings. The connection is more precise and more verifiable than prediction. It is the observation that each of these traditions, composed and preserved by people paying close and committed attention to the behavior of the physical world they inhabited, encoded accurate knowledge of what subduction zone megathrusts do to the ground, to the coastline, to the sea. That knowledge is the same knowledge that the monitoring community has spent the last 40 years building with seismometers and GPS receivers and sediment cores. The ancient record built it first. The modern record has confirmed and extended and quantified it. The two records are not in conflict. They are the same observation, made at different times, with different instruments, by people with the same fundamental commitment to documenting what the earth does so that others will know. The answer to the question posed in the briefing section of this report, the date that appears in two entirely separate archives, one written in Japanese, one preserved in the oral tradition of a coastal people who experienced the event directly, is January 26 to 27, 1700. The Japanese archive is the administrative record kept by the village headman of Miho at Kuwagasaki in Iwate Prefecture, noting the arrival of a tsunami with no felt earthquake on the morning of the 27th of January 1700. The other archive is the oral tradition of the Quileute and Ho peoples, describing the shaking and the rising of the ocean in the language of thunderbird and whale, the battle that shook the mountain and brought the great waters across the land. Both describe the same night. Both were produced within hours or days of the same event. Both are on the record. And the new research published in April and May 2026 is the most recent addition to that same record. The structural imaging, the synchronization evidence, the picture of a fault system whose internal architecture is more complex than previously mapped. The fault is there. The record is there. In both places. The data is in both records. The modern record and the ancient record describe the same geological system. The interpretation belongs to you. The broader geological context of the Cascadia Subduction Zone within the Pacific Ring of Fire is essential to understanding the full weight of what the 2026 research has added to the picture. The Ring of Fire is the zone of volcanic and seismic activity that encircles the Pacific Ocean, driven by the subduction of oceanic plates beneath continental and other oceanic plates around the Pacific Basin's margins. Approximately 90% of the world's earthquakes occur in the Ring of Fire, and essentially all of the world's magnitude 9 or greater earthquakes have occurred along subduction zone faults within it. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, the 1964 Good Friday earthquake in Alaska, magnitude 9.2, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North America. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, magnitude 9.1, which generated the tsunami that killed more than 227,000 people across 14 countries. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake, all subduction zones, all in or adjacent to the Ring of Fire. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is the North American segment of this global system. What makes Cascadia distinctive within the Ring of Fire is not its tectonic parameters, which are typical of a subduction zone megathrust, but its position relative to population. The Chilean subduction zone, when it produced the 1960 M9.5 event, was located off a coast with relatively sparse population. The Aleutian subduction zone, which produced the 1964 Alaska event and which continues to generate major earthquakes regularly, runs along one of the least densely populated coastlines in North America. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is offset from these analogs by a factor of tens of millions of people. The cities of Seattle, Portland, and Tacoma, with a combined metropolitan population of approximately 7 million, are located within the zone of catastrophic ground motion for a full margin Cascadia rupture. They are connected to the Pacific ports and to the rest of the country by infrastructure, bridges, highways, pipelines, power transmission lines that runs through the same ground motion zone. The Pacific Northwest's emergency management agencies have spent considerable effort over the past 3 decades developing evacuation maps, updated building codes, and public awareness campaigns specifically for the Cascadia scenario. The Oregon Resilience Plan, published in 2013, was one of the most detailed assessments ever produced by a state government of a specific natural disaster scenario's impact on critical infrastructure, public health, and recovery timelines. Its findings were sobering. A full margin Cascadia rupture would leave the coastal zone of Oregon inaccessible by road and sea for weeks to months, would damage the majority of unreinforced masonry buildings in the Portland area, would compromise a significant fraction of bridges and overpasses in the Willamette Valley, and would result in hospital systems overwhelmed beyond their operational capacity within hours of the event. The recovery timeline projected by the plan was measured in years to decades, not weeks or months. The Brandon Shuck study's finding that the Juan de Fuca Plate is fragmenting in ways that previous models did not fully capture is significant in the emergency management context, precisely because of what it means for rupture segmentation. A full margin Cascadia rupture, one that breaks the entire 600-mile fault simultaneously, is the highest magnitude scenario and would produce the strongest ground motion across the widest geographic area. But the paleoseismic record shows that not all Cascadia ruptures are full margin events. Some past ruptures broke only the northern section or only the southern section or segments of intermediate length. Understanding how the structural tears identified by Shuck's team interact with rupture propagation is directly relevant to understanding which population centers face the most severe ground motion in the range of possible Cascadia rupture scenarios. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, the Good Friday earthquake of the 27th of March, 1964, at magnitude 9.2 provides a specific precedent for understanding the ground motion and geomorphological effects of a Cascadia scale rupture in a North American setting. The 1964 earthquake ruptured a 620-mile section of the Alaska subduction zone, virtually the same length as the Cascadia fault. The ground motion from the earthquake lasted approximately 4.5 minutes. coastal areas dropped by as much as 6 feet and others rose by as much as 38 feet due to the mechanics of the subduction zone rupture. The Good Friday earthquake killed 139 people, an extraordinarily low casualty figure for an event of this scale, attributable to the low population density of coastal Alaska in 1964 and to the fact that the earthquake struck on a holiday afternoon when schools were empty. The same event occurring in coastal Washington on a weekday morning would be an event of a different order of consequence entirely. The specific question that the monitoring community is not yet able to answer, the question that no instrument or geological record can currently resolve, is when the fault will next rupture. The recurrence interval data from the sediment cores spans 10,000 years and 19 events. The shortest interval in that record is approximately 200 years. The longest is more than 700 years. The current interval of 326 years falls within the observed range. It provides no statistical basis for concluding that the rupture is either imminent or distant. Earthquake recurrence is not governed by a regular clock. The fault does not count years. It counts stress. What the ancient records examined in tonight's report add to this picture is not a prediction. They do not name the next Cascadia earthquake. They do not supply a date that the monitoring agencies can validate. What they add is something equally important: the experiential knowledge preserved across millennia of human observation that this fault has moved before, that it moves with extreme violence, and that the people living above it, who paid the most careful attention to its behavior, understood what it was capable of. The Quileute and Ho oral tradition preserves the experience of the 1700 rupture and possibly of earlier ones in terms that are accurate enough to be scientifically recognized. The Japanese village records preserve the physical evidence of the 1700 ruptures reach across the Pacific. Isaiah 24 preserves the Hebrew tradition's understanding that the earth can be broken and shaken beyond human experience. The Atharva Veda preserves the Vedic tradition's plea for protection from the earth's violence, from a tradition that had felt the earth shake. Together, they form a record that the modern monitoring data is not replacing, but confirming. The fault was there before the instruments. The instruments have added precision. The knowledge is older. As this report is filed tonight, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network continues its continuous monitoring of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The approximately 300 seismic stations of the PNSN are recording ground motion in real time across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and southwestern British Columbia. The USGS Earthquake Hazards Program is processing the April and May 2026 research findings through its internal review cycle. The Shake Alert Early Warning System is active across the 3 Pacific Coast states. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center's DART buoy network is deployed and transmitting from stations across the Pacific Basin. The locked zone is locked. The plates are converging. The stress is accumulating. The instruments are running. There are 5 specific things to watch in the coming weeks and months, and we name each one with the precision the data allows. First, the USGS National Seismic Hazard Model Update Process. The official Cascadia Hazard Model has not yet been updated to incorporate the structural findings from Brandon Shuck's April 29, 2026 plate fragmentation study, or the San Andreas synchronization findings from the 2nd of May 2026 paper. The National Seismic Hazard Mapping Project operates on a review cycle that typically runs over multiple years, involving external peer review, public comment periods, and coordination with building code standards organizations. Any announcement from the USGS or the National Seismic Hazard Mapping Project regarding a model revision in response to the new research will represent the monitoring community's most current official assessment of the regional hazard. Second, the ETS monitoring record for the Northern Cascadia segment. The next episodic tremor and slip event in the Northern Cascadia region, the area near Vancouver Island and the Nootka Fault Zone, where Shuck's imaging identified the active plate tier, is expected within the next 12 to 14 months, based on the approximately 1-4 month recurrence pattern. The PNSN and the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, British Columbia publish ETS event detections as part of their ongoing monitoring communications. The ETS record for the northern segment is of particular relevance given the new structural complexity identified in that region by the KC-21 imaging. Third, the scientific follow-up to the Shuck Plate fragmentation study. The research team has indicated that the next phase of work involves incorporating the newly identified structural tears into rupture propagation simulations, computational models of how seismic energy would distribute across the Cascadia Fault during a future megathrust rupture. The question the simulations will address is whether the tears in the descending slab act as barriers to rupture propagation or as conduits that channel seismic energy in specific direction. Different answers to that question have different implications for which communities in the Pacific Northwest would experience the most intense ground motion in a future event. Those simulation results, when published in the peer-reviewed literature, will represent the next significant update to the structural understanding of Cascadia rupture mechanics. Fourth, the West Coast Emergency Management response to the San Andreas synchronization finding. Any formal revision to California's Cascadia scenario planning, or any update to the Quileute system's response protocols for multi-fault cascade scenarios, will be visible in agency communications and regulatory filings. Whether and how quickly the new research findings are incorporated into official planning documents is itself information about the institutional response to evolving Cascadia science. Fifth, the ongoing academic attention to Pacific Northwest indigenous oral traditions as documentary evidence of Cascadia rupture history. Ruth Ludwig's foundational work has been followed by subsequent studies from researchers at the University of Washington, Simon Fraser University, and other institutions who are continuing to document and analyze the oral traditions of coastal peoples along the Cascadia Fault Zone. Any new analysis that extends the oral tradition evidence backward in time, or that provides more precise dating for pre-1700 Cascadia events through oral tradition combined with geological evidence, will extend the rupture history and sharpen the recurrence interval estimates used in hazard modeling. Tonight's report has filed a specific kind of record. It began with the science. 2 studies published within a 4-week window in April and May 2026 that have materially changed the structural picture of the most dangerous fault system in North America. The first showed, for the first time, a subduction zone actively breaking apart at a structural level, not rupturing in an earthquake, but fragmenting internally as the descending plate tears under the stress of unequal subduction rates at its boundary. The second showed that this fault system can synchronize its rupture with the San Andreas, producing a combined multi-system cascade that would affect the entire Pacific coast of the United States. The report then traced that picture through the monitoring infrastructure, the PNSN, the USGS, the Quileute system, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, and through the geological and historical record of the last Cascadia megathrust rupture, which occurred at 9 inches the evening on the 26th of January 1700, established through the ghost forests of Washington, the sediment cores of the Pacific Northwest coast, and the administrative records of Japanese village scribes on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. 326 years of accumulated strain since the last great release. And the report examined, in 4 ancient traditions from 4 different civilizations, what the people who watch this system most carefully recorded about what it does. The Quileute and Ho peoples, who experienced the 1700 rupture directly and encoded it in the tradition of Thunderbird and Whale. The Japanese village scribes of Iwate Prefecture, who documented the Orphan tsunami with precise administrative care and noted the anomaly of a wave without an earthquake. The Hebrew prophet who composed Isaiah 24 and described the earth broken and split and shaken in language precise enough to be cited in a description of subduction zone ground motion. The Vedic composers of the Prithvi Sukta who addressed the earth as a living, trembling physical reality and asked for protection from its violence. Each tradition was kept by people who understood, in the vocabulary available to them, that the ground beneath their communities was not unconditionally stable. Each tradition preserved that knowledge across time. Each tradition is now sitting on the same analytical table as the USGS hazard maps and the PNSN seismic catalog and the KC21 imaging data, all pointing at the same geological system, all describing the same underlying reality from different positions in time and space. What this report can confirm is what the data confirms. The fault is there. The plates are converging at the rates the GPS network measures. The lock zone is accumulating strain at the rates the geodetic monitoring shows. The internal structure of the descending slab is more complex than the prior models described. The synchronization risk with the San Andreas is in the turbidite record. The last rupture was 326 years ago. The indigenous oral traditions preserved the account of that rupture in language that researchers now formally recognize as geographically and phenomenologically accurate documentary evidence. The Japanese records supply the date. The ghost forests supply the season. The monitoring continues tonight. The instruments are recording. The record continues to accumulate. If tonight's report is the kind of reporting that brings you back, if the layer beneath the science and the layer beneath the history and the ancient record that was keeping this observation before any instrument existed, if that work is useful to you tonight, then subscribe. This channel files every night. Each report is its own complete document, independent of the ones before it and the ones that follow. The archive holds the same method applied across the range of events this channel covers: volcanic, oceanic, solar, seismic, atmospheric, each one examined through the modern monitoring data and the historical and ancient record together. If tonight is your first report here, the archive is the same voice applied to different events, building the same kind of convergence between what is happening now and what the record has always known. Subscribe now. Share tonight's report with someone in the Pacific Northwest who would want to see the full record, the science, the traditions, and the Japanese village document, and the 3 to 6 year gap that connects all of them. Drop your location in the comments. Tell us what you make of the new research. Tell us if you are in the coverage zone. Your observation enters the permanent record of what this channel is building. The file stays open. We will report again tomorrow.